My name is Raymond Kwong. I am an advocate with Disability Rights California. So today I have with me a colleague, Leilani Pfeiffer. She and I will be doing the background logistics to support our presenters today. Senior Attorney Maria Iriarte and our Staff Attorney Emily Ikuda. So just a real quick overview of our agency and what we do. Disability Rights California, we are a statewide nonprofit agency, and we provide free legal services to people with disabilities with any disability-related issues. Our agency started in 1978. We were called Protection and Advocacy Inc. back then and changed our name to Disability Rights California in 2008. And every state has a protection and advocacy such as ours. They might be called a little bit different. It could be called Disability Rights Oregon, for example, Disability Rights New York, but we essentially do the same thing. We have offices statewide in California, our headquarters being in Sacramento, and offices in Fresno, Oakland, Los Angeles, Ontario, San Diego, just to name a few. We have attorneys and advocates that can handle a variety of issues, from access and discrimination issues with housing, with transportation, with education, which includes special ed and higher education. We can also help with public health benefits such as Medi-Cal, in-home supportive services, Social Security overpayment issue that relates to work. And within our agency, we also have separate programs such as the Office of Client Rights Advocates, or OCRA, that specialize in helping clients of the regional center, and our Client Assistance Program, or CAP, that helps clients of the Department of Rehab. So before we get the presentation started, all the materials you see today, along with links in the chat, will be sent to you after the presentation. And if you'd like to make an appointment to speak to the private appointment just to talk about your issue, our intake number is in the chat. It's 800-776-5746. So without further ado, I will pass it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Flavia, for inviting us to be here today. This is a very basic training on the self-determination program. So if you're already in self-determination, a lot of this information is probably stuff you already know. You're welcome to stay on, but it really is what they would call self-determination 101. We're going to take questions at the end of the presentation. If we don't know the answer to your question, we will find out what the answer is and provide it to Flavia so that she could circulate the answer to your questions, because sometimes we don't have the answers to all of the questions. So let's start talking about self-determination. Go to the next slide. What is it? How is it different from the traditional model? So the traditional model is that you develop an individual program plan and an IPP. That's the contract that the consumer has with the regional center. It is supposed to be person-centered, a person-centered plan, and we're going to talk about a little bit what that means. You go through the regional center for eligibility. You're assigned a service coordinator. The service coordinator is there to do case management, to talk to you, to have that IPP meeting, to develop the IPP, to put the services and supports in place. Services are provided through vendor providers. So the people who provide the services have gone through a process with the regional center. So that's been the model since the regional centers were established in California. So then comes self-determination. And so is it? It's a program where consumers are given a specific budget and they develop a spending plan. You still have person-centered planning. You still have an IPP. You can get your services through a vendor or not a vendor. So that's different from the traditional model. You can have an independent facilitator to assist you, and we're going to talk about what this person does. And you will be using a financial management service. They are, and Emily will talk more about that. They manage the spending plan, they pay the providers, and they do other things. So under self-determination, you get a budget, you put together a spending plan, you have more control over developing the services and supports that you want. Um, for what purpose? To be healthy, safe, and comfortable in your community, to do the kind to navigate your community, to be a part of your community. And the regional centers are still involved. Department of Developmental Services is the statewide agency that makes sure that regional centers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it oversees the regional center system in California. We have this system. It's as a result of state law. So we're not talking about federal law here. We're talking strictly about state law. One thing to know is that if you're on the DD waiver and you want to become part of the self-determination program, you're going to be switching to the self-determination waiver. So that's something that you need to know if you do want to get into the self-determination program. Next slide. So a little background, in 1998, there was a pilot project where they chose 200 people to be part of what they were calling the self-determination program. The result of the participation by these people is that they felt that the program gave them more freedom, more responsibility in choosing their service providers and handling their own money, right? Because they've got this budget. So after July 1st of 2021, the program opened up to everyone who is a consumer of the regional center. And it's voluntary. You don't have to go into the self-determination program. You can stay in the traditional model that I described earlier. Next slide. So there are 5 principles of self-determination. The freedom to decide how you want to live your life. You're going to have authority over your budget to purchase the services and supports that you choose. You're going to have support. Maybe you decide you want an independent facilitator. You're going to have a financial management services to help you, for instance, pay the staff, people to help organize resources. You're handling the purse here, so you've got responsibility to handle the money wisely. And your role in this program is to make decisions and oversee the services that you need. The person-centered planning principle is really important. It was important before, but it's also important in the traditional model, but also important in this model of service. Next slide. So, how do you enroll into the self-determination program? To be eligible, you've got to be a consumer of the regional center, right? And you can't be living in a licensed facility. So, for example, if you're living in an intermediate care facility for the developmentally disabled, there are different levels of care within the ICFDD world. You can't enroll in the self-determination program. There is an exception. If you have been identified as someone who will be leaving an institution within 90 days, then you can start the process to enroll into the self-determination program. You're going to have to attend an orientation training. Those orientation trainings are provided by regional centers. So if you're interested in enrolling in the self-determination program, you should be talking to the service coordinator about that and figuring out what programs orientation programs they offer. Also, orientation programs are offered by the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. You can go on to this link to learn more about their orientation programs and to sign up for one. Next slide. So what's going to happen during the orientation process? You're going to learn about person-centered planning. You're going to learn about budgets and spending plans and how to arrange services. You're going to learn about independent facilitators and what financial management services will do, what their role is in the self-determination program. And we are going to talk about all of these here in this training. Next slide. So let's talk about person-centered planning. This shouldn't be new because in the traditional model, you were also doing person-centered planning. So it's what it sounds like, person-centered. So what is it that I want in my future? What are my goals if I were a consumer of the regional center? I'm the person, the consumer who leads the process. I may want to invite people in my circle of support. Maybe I've identified my mom and my sister's people I want to be in my circle of support, and I want to invite my circle of support to be part of this person-centered planning process. The goals and what I do should reflect what's important to me. And once I've put my person-centered planning together, then after that, my IPP will be written based on the things I want to do in my life. So the IPP will lay out the goals and what services and supports are needed to reach those goals. So that's the way that it works. You don't have to do a person-centered planning. It's optional, but it certainly starts the process of people thinking about, well, what is it that I really want to do, right, in the future? So I always encourage people to do this. Next slide. Okay, so it's a plan. The person-centered planning is a plan. It could include things like, what do I want to do for recreation or transportation, therapies, what do I want to do for a job, family relations. The plan should clearly state outcomes. It should include my strengths as a consumer, my hopes, the supports I'm going to need in order to participate meaningfully in the community. And the goals should not be restricted because there is a lack of services or reports or vendors. That shouldn't be it. And you might think of having an independent facilitator to support and advocate for you at the person-centered planning meeting. Next slide. Speaking of independent facilitators, I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are. When you're in the self-determination program, you can decide that you want to have someone act as your independent facilitator. It's optional. You don't have to do it. This person is going to help make informed decisions about your budget, locate and coordinate and access services and supports that are consistent with your IPP. Identify immediate and long-term needs and ways to meet those needs. Lead, participate, advocate on your behalf in your person-centered planning and in developing the IPP. And so this person can be really valuable in the self-determination program. But like I said, you do not have to have an independent facilitator. Next slide. You can have more than one independent facilitator if you want. So really important to know is that the independent facilitators are paid from your spending plan. And you're going to negotiate what you're going to pay the facilitator, and it's paid out of your budget. So it's really important to know, and that the budget is not going to increase to include the cost of the independent facilitator. So let's say that the regional center gives you a budget, a yearly budget of $60,000 for your services and supports. Out of those $60,000, you're going to have to pay the cost. If you want an independent facilitator, you're going to have to pay the cost through from that $60,000. Parents can be independent facilitators, but if you're a parent of a minor child, you cannot be paid to be an independent facilitator. Same thing if you're a spouse of a consumer in the self-determination program, you cannot be paid to be an independent facilitator. If the independent facilitator wants to be your independent facilitator for free, that could be the case too. They could volunteer their services. And your conservator can be your independent facilitator, but cannot be paid for this. Now, you can also choose to have the regional center service coordinator be your independent facilitator. You do not pay them to be independent facilitators, but their role as a quote unquote independent facilitator is limited by the fact that they can't help you locate services or negotiate pay of your providers. So, other than that, they can do the other things that the independent facilitators could do. Next slide. Independent facilitators are not required to have a certificate or a license, although I have heard of independent facilitators. I've heard of them getting a lot of training. It's something you might want to ask when you're shopping around for an independent facilitator is like, you could develop a series of questions about, well, what do you know about really as from the basics, like what do you know about the self-determination program, what the role of the independent facilitator, how, their experience with regional centers, maybe the independent facilitator has a child or has family who's been involved in the regional center system. So you're going to want to, ask a lot of questions. How many people they are currently independent facilitators for, lots of things. But although they don't need to be certified and they don't have licenses, they are required to get some training on the principles of self-determination, the person-centered planning process, and other responsibilities that they would have, including coordinating services for your IPP. So this is, if you're asking yourself, well, where could I get more information? The we're going to take at the end of the presentation, we're going to take you to the DDS website, the whole section on self-determination, and there's a lot of information there about independent facilitators. State Council on Developmental Disabilities can also provide independent facilitator training. So if you're interested in becoming an independent facilitator, you might want to reach out to them and see what kind of training. Next slide. So service providers. Next slide. So remember, in the traditional system, you had to get services from a provider who was vendored through the regional center. In other words, went through a process to become a vendor. You can use someone who is not a vendor or not contracted with the regional center to provide services to you, which is obviously very different from the traditional model. Next slide. Now, service providers, they're under certain circumstances will need to get criminal background checks. So if you are providing direct personal care services, you know, grooming, feeding, cleaning, those kinds of services, you're going to have to undergo a criminal background check. If the Financial Management Services Agency requests a background check, you're going to have to get it. So if you are someone who wants to be a service provider and you have a violation or conviction in your record, you're going to need to request an exemption from the state agency that administers uh, uh, the whole program. That's Department of Developmental Services. And it's the service provider's responsibility or their employing agency. It's their responsibility to pay for the cost of the background check. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn this over to Emily, who's going to continue talking about a lot of more interesting things. Emily.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be covering the other half of this presentation and going over the remainder of the core elements, aspects of the self-determination program. And an important one is the Financial Management Services, or FMS. So what are FMS? What is an FMS? What is a financial management service? So generally, the FMS, they help to manage your budget, your money, by paying bills and paying your service providers. So in a sense, they're like handling the flow of money, kind of like an accountant. They pay service providers directly, and FMSs may require service providers to show that they are actually qualified. They have the skills, training needed to deliver those services for you. FMSs may also require that a provider undergo background checks. And also importantly, FMSs are themselves a service provider. So they're a service provider, but their service is making sure that the money is being funneled to compensate the providers of your choice, that is paid out of your budget in SDP. So what that means is that FMSs are the only service provider that has to be vendored with the regional center. Maria mentioned that the main difference between SDP and the traditional way the regional center does things is that if you are interested in a specific individual or service provider and you're like, oh, but they're not vendored, contracted with the regional center, do they have to go through that whole process? No. But so that is in fact the case, but there is still one provider that has to be contracted with the regional center, and that is the FMS that is helping distribute the money in your budget. FMSs will only use the funds in your individual budget to pay for services included and described in your individual program plan, or IPP. You are required to use the services of an FMS. That said, while you have to go with an FMS, you can choose which FMS you're most comfortable with. There should be more than there's usually multiple FMS agency options that you can pick from. And there's actually different ways that they go through this process of spending the funds in your budget, which I will go into more detail in the following slides. So who pays this FMS provider, this FMS that has to be involved and vendored with the regional center? Well, the cost of the FMS will be paid out of your individual budget. You will need to work with your FMS to determine when, for instance, overtime pay is required. But similar to the independent facilitator that Maria covered, your individual budget cannot be augmented to include the cost of an FMS. It's not increased specifically. It has to be taken out of whatever budget the team ends up being approving for your plan. If you're thinking, okay, well, where can I find information about these FMS providers, these agencies? DDS does have a list of those agencies. I put the link there, but I also recommend that you talk with your regional center. If you know, it's going to be a topic that will come up if you are planning to go through the whole SDP process. And each regional center should have an up-to-date list of the FMS providers that work with them. So I mentioned before that there are actually like some different ways. So the FMS, they all handle the money in your budget, but there's some variation in how they categorize themselves and go through that process of checking the qualifications, obtaining the services of those providers. Again, as Maria mentioned, this is a very bare bones overview. If you have specific questions about each of these models, this is definitely the topics that you should specifically raise with your service coordinator, the regional center, to get more information and see which type of model of which type of FMS works best for you. So one of the FMS, there's actually 3 types of FMS, and one of them is the bill payer model. So again, this is just a general overview of how it's done through this bill payer way. Goods or services are purchased directly from a business. The FMS pays for goods and services listed in your IPP. And there's actually, at least like how it's defined, there's no employee-employer relationship between you, the FMS handling the budget, or the service provider that's providing services, whether that be like respite or something along those lines that's included in your IPP. Another common one is the co-employer model. So in a sense, you're actually sharing the employer role and responsibility with the FMS. So both you and the FMS are working together to, review the qualifications, choose the service providers that you want to obtain and pay to help support you. FMS, in this case, in this model, the FMS is the employer of record. They're the ones employing the providers that you still are choosing to help support you. The FMS maintains primary employer liability, and so they're the ones who handle the required insurance. FMS also verifies provider qualifications and processes payroll. And the final model is the sole employer. So the sole employer is generally the one where you, as the participant, the main person in SDP, have the most involvement in reviewing qualifications, hiring, paying out staff. Nonetheless, there is still an FMS that must be involved. So you are actually the employer of record of these providers for the services that are in your plan. Nonetheless, the FMS will still assist you by ensuring that you follow all applicable employment laws, that still verifies qualifications of those service providers and payroll processing. But you are the one, the participant, the recipient of those services. You're the one who is required to obtain any necessary employment insurances, and also, if necessary, handling the workers' compensation. So one thing that you've been hearing a lot all throughout this presentation, and we finally get to explaining what it is the individual budget. But and you're probably already getting a good idea of what that is, but I'm just going to go over just what the budget is and how it's determined, how it's estimated. So, but let's start with the basics. What is an individual budget, or IB? Because of course, everything must be acronyms. It is the amount of money you have available to purchase needed services and supports in SDP. The budget is determined by the IPP team. So it's you, it's the your IF or IFs if you have more than one. It's also service providers and, of course, the regional center themselves who are funding and putting money into that budget. Everyone has to be in agreement of what the ultimate amount of that budget will be. The budget, but that being said, how do we even get to the point of like a starting point? Like, okay, where do we start from to eventually get an idea of what the budget amount will be? So in general, the budget is based on the cost of services and supports that the regional center spent for you in the previous year, the last 12 months. Specifically, it is based on the regional center's purchase of service expenditures for your services. And this is important because I want to emphasize that it's expenditures, what was actually spent by the regional center, not what was authorized. And this is important because there can be situations that what is actually spent versus what is actually authorized is not the same. And just for purposes of clarifying that, I'll give an example. Let's say you were authorized, the regional center offered to pay 30 hours per month of respite at some point the previous year. But for various reasons, you were not able to actually utilize those 30 hours per month. And the reasons could be you couldn't find an appropriate respite worker. You just an emergency happened, or something made it so that you couldn't arrange a respite, your family couldn't arrange for or plan out that respite provider to fully use all 30 hours. So in the end, you end up, or your family only end up utilizing half of that, 15 hours per month. So let's say you're in SDP, you're going over that plan and figuring out the amount. Does the regional center and take into account the cost of the 30 hours per month authorized, or the 15 hours that you actually used, that was actually spent? It's going to be the latter, the 15 hours. So that's why it's really important to be aware of this distinction between expenditures and authorized amount of hours or services. Now, that being said, if you're like, but what if I actually needed those 30 hours per month of respite? It's just stuff happened where I was not able to fully utilize it. Does that mean I have to go with a smaller, reduced amount that I was only able to get? No, so what you should be prepared to do is to argue before your IPP team, the regional center, be like, look, I or my child, we needed those 30 hours per month of respite. We didn't fully utilize them because of circumstances outside our control. We couldn't find a provider. We couldn't find a worker with the qualifications or the training. Or there was an emergency that happened where I literally was not able to follow through and arrange that respite provider. But nonetheless, we needed those service hours. So the argument you're making is that, look, despite what the expenditure was, there was still need for the 30 hours per month. And therefore, the budget should take into account the higher authorized amount, because that is in fact what we and what my child still need. So I'm just giving you this heads up of how you can prepare to argue for a higher amount than just what the expenditures are, if there's like legitimate needs that are being unmet. Or changes in circumstances. And I'm somewhat getting ahead of myself because I do mention this later in the PowerPoint, but I did want to make that link between that and why it's why not to be caught off guard if the regional center keeps things at just expenditures. And okay, yeah, I pretty much explained that, expenditures versus authorization. Oh yeah, like I said, so changes to the individual budget. So let's say, for example, the amount for spent for the previous year doesn't accurately reflect what what you fully need. Or let's say after a year, something happens, you need some new or additional services. Does the budget change? Yes, it does. Your individual budget is redetermined each year, going up and down depending on changing needs. One of them is changing circumstances. Something happened. There was an emergency. There was an event. There was some big major the global change, like let's say a pandemic, that appended things where you have to go back and be like, you know what, I'm going to need an increase in these services and an increase in the budget to match. Another one is unaddressed or unmet needs, where there, despite what was spent the previous year, were there areas of need that were not sufficiently taken into account by the regional center, needs that need to be added in the form of more money in your budget. So this is where that it's important to be prepared, specifically focus and hone in on those areas where you or your child were lacking in needed supports and services that you didn't get from in your IPP, from or approved in the previous year. What if I and the regional center don't agree on the amount I need in my individual budget? Because I talked about how you need the IPP team to be in agreement, but let's say there, you ask for this much funding, including to meet unmet needs, other kinds of, the amount that's more than just expenditures, and the regional center is like, no, we don't believe that you need that higher amount. We're gonna offer this and no more. And it's like, okay, what do you do then? What happens if there is a dispute? There's a disagreement. If there is a disagreement, you actually have the option of appealing any decision by the regional center, including a decision to refuse to raise the budget to account for a service that you believe you need. So if there is a disagreement about an increase in the budget, you still have the right to appeal. So so this is where that right to argue, to go to fair hearing, to argue for a service is no different with SDP. Just as you would ask for and have the right to challenge a denial of a service under the traditional system, in the SDP, if you're like, oh, I'm requesting a service in the form of like an increase in budget to meet that service need. Oh, you disagree? Oh, that's a denial of a service. It's effectively a denial if the regional center is saying no to increasing your budget. Okay, give me that notice and my right to appeal. So you do have that option to disagree, to go to fair hearing. And like I said, if there's any disagreement about services, including the amount in your budget to cover those services, the regional center must give you a notice of action, a written letter explaining, confirming that they've made a decision, that whether it's a denial, and also why they're saying no. And with that notice of action, the timeline starts for you, if you choose to to file for fair hearing to appeal. And this is stuff we cover in presentations just about fair hearings and appeals and complaints. But just a heads up, you have 60 days of the date you get that notice letter to appeal. And yeah, you have and when you appeal, that means actually going before an administrative judge arguing, hey, this is why I need this service. This is why the regional center's decision is wrong. I want you, the judge, this is why I am going to fair hearing and want you to side with me about increasing the budget. So that's what the appeals process option allows you to do if there is such a disagreement. Another important aspect that is very much a part that comes with the budget is your spending plan. And I'll go over like what that spending plan is and how that differs from the individual budget. But again, they're like one comes with the other. So what is the difference between a spending plan and your individual budget? So the individual budget is the amount, the actual, full, the number of the money you have available to pay for services and supports. The spending plan is how you will use that money to pay for services and supports. So the spending plan is that plan that goes into detail about like, okay, this amount of money will go to pay for this. This amount of money will go to pay for that. You can only buy services and supports that are approved by the federal government. So this relates back to the fact that SDP, as Maria mentioned, it is one of those kinds of waiver programs and also gets funding from the federal government. If there are services where the federal government is like, no, you can't use our money to pay for that, that applies to SDP. And as with the individual budget, the IPP team, including the regional center, is the one that approves your spending plan. That being said, the commonality between of SDP and the traditional system is you still got to go and explore generic resources. You cannot purchase the same or similar service if you could get that service from some other public agency. And I think the following slides I'll just discuss that more, although you all are probably familiar with generic resources. Changes to the spending plan. So the services in your spending plan, like how they're categorized and what's used to pay for what, it actually falls under 3 categories. One of them is living arrangements. The second is employment and community participation. And the third is health and safety. So whatever services that you are getting, they have to fall under one of these 3. Let's say that you're not let's say you have a situation where you're like, I really want to spend, I want to have more money to for community participation, like going out to an outing, some social recreation. And so you want to do more of that. And you're not changing the budget. Like, oh, no, I'm not arguing or disputing the budget amount, but can I take some money from this category and move it to that category? Can I reduce spending in, for example, what I have for health and safety, whatever that service is, and then push that money to do more stuff in the community? Yes, you can. So you can move 10% from one category to another. Now, if you need to move more than 10% between categories, you can do it, but you need to get the IPP team and the regional center involved, and who also must agree. So basically, the 10% is what you can choose to move around from one category to another without having to tell the regional center about it. More than 10%, you got to let them know. Now, one thing, Maria went into detail about the independent facilitator. What about the regional center's service coordinator? Do they still play any role in this process? They do. So the regional centers, or they can be, the service coordinator, they can still help with services and supports that are provided through the RC system. They are of course involved with the decisions and determining your individual budget. They actually are still going to be involved with developing that IPP that also is going to be created after your person-centered plan. And if there's a situation where you're like, regional center, can you cover the role of IF in this situation? Or if you want to, you can do that. More or less basically having the service coordinator get back, come back in and get involved in the service coordinator role, even though you're an SDP. But again, it's your choice. So another resource we want to let you guys know about is this office with DDS, the Department of Developmental Services, called the SDP Ombudsperson. So this is another way to report like serious issues, resolve disputes by raising it to the ombudsperson. And it's also a way where it's not just about a general disagreement about the amount in your budget. There's like really serious issues going on, just getting things off the ground, or issues going on with, let's say, your FMS. That's where it would make sense to consider raising that to the SDP ombudsperson. So to give an example, I had a client who was in SDP. He got a budget, got a spending plan. The issue wasn't the amount, and everyone agreed to the amount. The issue was that the FMS that he went with, the FMS who, as I mentioned, handles the money and paying out the service providers, well, the FMS wasn't being responsive. Service providers were like, hey, we haven't been paid yet. What's going on, you guys? And the participant was like, hey, FMS, this provider hasn't been paid yet. What's going on? And the FMS is like not being responsive, or they're like, we have a overload right now. We'll get back to you. And it's like it's a really bad situation where it's like, look, if my provider doesn't get paid, they're going to walk. So FMS, what are you doing? That's a situation where we recommended that they report it to the SDP ombudsperson, where it wasn't just about a general disagreement. There was a serious issue where the FMS, who was supposed to be paying the providers, wasn't being responsive. So I'm just giving you an example of a type of issue that got raised to the SDP ombudsperson. And I included the information about that the ombudsperson's contact information. So there's the email, there's the phone number, and there's the webpage where you can look it up yourself. We've actually covered the end. So again, this is just a basic Cliff Notes overview of the self-determination program, but I wanted to end off with these lists of really helpful resources, not just from us, but from other agencies. So as for DRC, that's our webpage, our website. For more information, not just about SDP, but also generally about regional center services and the system, we refer you to our manual, Rights Under the Lanterman Act, or RULA. There are English, of course there's English, but there's also Spanish translations of the chapters posted on our website. If you want it in another language not there, please, you can contact us, request that information in your native language. And in addition to RULA, there are other publications we have that also include tips, advice, resources relating to Regional Center. These are other great helpful resources about self-determination program. One is the Office of Clients' Rights Advocacy, OCRA. They are also from Disability Rights California, and each regional center has a client's rights advocate. Another organization is Disability Voices United, or DVU, and pretty much every week they have a presentation about or relating to SDP, and really going into the details about certain issues about FMSs and how to find your providers. It's a great resource, and they have recordings all posted on their website at this link. So SDP, so they call them the SDP Connect. I believe there are Spanish interpretations available, but but if it's something that you need in your native language, you can also contact DVU as well to ask for resources in other languages, including recordings if possible. Another great resource, the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, or SCDD. There's their webpage, and they're actually one of the ones that provide orientations on SDP. So they, of course, would be very knowledgeable about the self-determination program, including trainings for independent facilitators. Finally, there is, of course, the Department of Developmental Services, the state agency that oversees all the regional centers. And so I just included the links to their web pages on SDP. They also have a really informative FAQ on SDP. So if you're still wanting to look into, get a better understanding of SDP before really jumping headfirst into the orientation and stuff like that, I recommend going to these links. Okay, there we've reached the end. So we are at the point where we are opening it up to question and answer. But like I said, this is a very general overview. This is something where, as you really get into the details, that's information where you would learn more if you went through like the SDP orientations, which are significantly longer than this kind of presentation. But we will do our best to answer any questions you have about our presentation.